The wind came like a hand trying to pull the world apart. Snow drove sideways across Route 285, flinging white sheets against the diner's windows until the neon sign blurred into a ghostly halo. Headlights petered out into the storm, then vanished. Tires spun. Engines coughed and died. Cars were swallowed by the night. Inside the Silver Maple, a single bulb hummed over the counter while coffee steamed in chipped mugs. Amara Johnson tightened her knit sweater around her shoulders and ran a towel along the chrome rail, the motion a small, quiet rhythm against the howl outside. She had the kind of hands that showed the story of a life lived, soft at the palms from washing dishes, a faint scar across the knuckle from a busted plate, nails with the ghost of ink where she marked orders late into the evening. Before the rest of the world folded under the storm, before the internet lit up with viral headlines and camera crews mapped their way through closed roads, there was a moment that was nothing more than a woman doing what she had always done, making coffee for whoever came through her door. If you love emotional and heartwarming stories, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell, so you'll always be the first to hear our next story. Now, let's begin. The Silver Maple sat 2 hours from Denver, straddling the point where highway turned from flat prairie into the first slopes of the Colorado Rockies. Red vinyl stools lined the counter. A jukebox hummed old R&B on low, and framed photographs of fishing trips and high school graduations clustered on the walls like a small-town scrapbook. To anyone driving past, it was the kind of place that promised coffee and a smile and nothing more. Amara had been working nights at the Silver Maple for 4 years. She had come to that stretch of highway after dropping out of community college when her mother's arthritis got worse and bills began to stack like snowfall. Evelyn Johnson had once been a nurse who smelled faintly of lavender and antiseptic. She had taught Amara how to fold hospital corners and how to keep hope precise and clasped like a bandage. Amara kept the lessons in her pocket like coins. On the night the world froze, she was closing up, counting the small pile of bills that would pay next month's rent if she recited the numbers twice and believed hard enough. The jukebox slipped into a slow ballad. The coffee machine burbled. Outside, the first flakes came thick as sawdust and stayed. By 11, the storm had teeth. It ate the highway. Phones blinked, no service. The diner's owner, an old man named Hank who had run the place since before Amara was born, decided it was safer to lock the front door. They left the stools turned on the counter, like hats on the backs of chairs, and lit every lamp they had. Then the headlights sliced through the blur. A single pair, then another, then a procession. Limousines in black, impossibly sleek, their tires sinking into the snow like knives. One by one, 15 figures appeared at the threshold, coats hemmed with frosted breath and mahogany shoes scuffed by white. They moved with the awkwardness of people who had never had to button their own coats in a wind, the way children fumble with grown things. They entered not with the swagger the tabloids had taught the town to expect, but like people who had been carried too far from the shore and were grateful for any land. Amara saw their faces distilled by the weather-lined, stunned, frightened. Luxury had not prepared them for cold. Titles and bank accounts meant nothing when heaters died and engines failed. Her first reaction was the same she gave every hungry person who pushed through her door. Set more coffee on, make space at a table, offer a blanket without asking how much the other person was worth. It was not a revolutionary action. It was a habit. She moved with a steady efficiency. 2 pots on, soup ladled, radio tuned for updates, while the storm pressed against the glass like a hand at the throat of the world. Names came slowly as the men warmed and phones fumbled back to life. There was Marcus Leland, a private equity kingpin whose face looked smaller without the lens of a magazine. Thomas Keene, whose fund handled money most families never saw in a lifetime. Elliot Rhodes, a young tech wunderkind whose company's algorithms could predict human taste. Alejandro Ruiz. No, that was the Spanish original. Here he was Richard Langford, a financier whose influence bent markets. Miguel Santos, a veteran of construction and an empire built from dirt and sweat. Each name was a headline, but in the tin-lit warmth, They were only people with teeth chattering and fingers turning the color of ripe apples from cold. Conversation at first was small and embarrassed, about fuel lines and GPS reroutes, about assistants who could not be reached. Some tried to call chauffeurs, some paced like trapped predators. Amara moved through them all with mugs balanced, a bumper of normalcy in a world that had lost its bearings. She did not ask who they were, and they did not announce their titles. They sat. They drank. The whole diner seemed to hold its breath until the storm calmed like a beast deciding to nap instead of hunt. Hours dissolved into an odd intimacy, the kind that happens when people are made equal by circumstance. The men, accustomed to being served by armies of staff, found themselves on the same wooden benches as truck drivers and a nurse who'd stopped for a night shift. Wealth had become a paper thing, irrelevant when the fundamental need was warmth and human connection. It was after midnight, when snow had thickened into a white curtain, that voices climbed beyond the practical and into confession. A joke here, a pained laugh there, the kind of small sounds that open the door to more serious things. A man at the far table, mid-50s, gray at the temple, with a jaw that had made contracts for a living, stared into his coffee as if it might reflect a life he had not yet examined. He told the story first, slow and broken. Once he had a daughter, he said. She had been clever and stubborn and wanted to paint instead of join the family office. He had laughed it off then. He did not hear her when she begged for time, for attention. She had left. Years later, he learned she had taken herself from the world. He did not say the word suicide. That silence was heavy enough. The confession hung like steam. No one offered platitudes. No one had words that could stitch up the wound. But Amara shifted a chair, set a hand on the man's shoulder like a seamstress steadying fabric, and stayed. She did not try to fix what was broken. She bore witness. Her presence was the kind of thing that refused to let the grief be swallowed by ego or dismissed by money. One by one, stories fell out, business partnerships that had stolen marriages, daughters who no longer called, sons raised on the idea that love equaled provision, not presence. They named the empty places. There were passwords for everything but no password for a child's heart. Men who had known power confessed to a poverty of time. Some cried quietly. Others sat harder, jaw clenched as if to hold together whatever reputation had kept them afloat all these years. Amara listened. She had her own ghosts, late nights studying accounting in borrowed textbooks. An eviction notice folded in her back pocket once until the landlord took pity. A scraped knuckle from a broken bowl that still ached when the temperature dropped. But she did not center her pain. She met theirs with a plainness that was almost holy. A steady chair offered, a refilled cup, an occasional soft word like, "You're not alone tonight." The simplicity stunned them. These were men used to being flattered, to deals and spectacle, to people performing gratitude as if it were social currency. Amara's kindness expected nothing in return. It was not performative. It was not strategic. It was authentic and therefore terrifying to men who had learned to manufacture their own reflections. By 3 a.m, something subtle had shifted. The men who strode boardrooms with iron intent now spoke in the language of regret and small hopes. The storm's rhythm outside was in counterpoint to the thaw inside the diner. Harsh winds translated into softer voices. They began to ask questions not about balance sheets, but about lives, questions that made their hands look like fragile things. One man asked about photography. Another asked, almost childlike, why one would be satisfied without trophies. A younger tech founder, normally guarded beneath an armor of wry jokes, admitted to a hollow in his chest that no algorithm could patch. The stories peeled layers away, one confession at a time, until the room was raw and true in a way it had never been when power was the currency. When rescue crews finally began to plow through at dawn, when engines coughed back to life and the road shimmered with the first tentative shine of cleared asphalt, there was an awkwardness to departure. Limousines that had seemed like black beetles in the snow lined up, chauffeurs huddled, but the men who climbed into those cars did not climb back into the same selves that had stumbled through the diner hours before. One of the older men, Richard, stepped to the counter before leaving. He placed a small card on the worn formica with fingers that still trembled slightly, not from cold, but from something else he could not name. The card was embossed, monochrome, the kind that spoke of access and invitations and pathways that money could buy. He pressed it into Amara's hand and said, simply, "If you ever need anything, call this number." Amara looked at the card, at the digits that mapped operators and private lines, and at the man whose fortune could erase the arithmetic of her worries in a single signature. She smiled, not with shock, but with a warmth that had nothing to do with gratitude rehearsed for cameras. "You warmed more than my hands tonight," she said. "You warmed my faith, too." He left with a nod and a silence that felt like a hinge closing. The limousines rolled away, leaving behind prints that were swallowed by new wind. Amara wiped the counter, stacked cups, and turned the sign to closed, as if the night had been no different from any other. She walked the 2 blocks home to a small duplex where her mother kept the kettle always near boil and the radio tuned to late-night blues. She slept, heavy with fatigue and some small new weight of possibility that had begun as a card tucked into her palm. The morning broke thin and pale. The neighborhood still smelled of snow and wet earth and the faintly medicinal lavender from Evelyn's hand cream. Amara made coffee and started the slow, exacting rituals of a life rebuilt around small, dependable things. She did not expect the sound that arrived next. The low, insistent hum that grows and grows until it becomes an event. Cars came down the quiet street with the exactness of a parade. Bentleys, Rolls-Royces, black SUVs, a low-slung phalanx of vehicles that no one on the block owned and no local insurance planned for. They filled the street in front of Amara's small home until her neighbor's mailbox seemed dwarfed by chrome and leather. Hands reached into trunks. Boxes were carried. White-gloved assistants stepped onto porches where snow still clung to the bushes. Reporters would later call it a spectacle. Neighbors would later call it surreal. At the time, Amara only felt her heart pound with a bewilderment that carried a note of fear. She opened the door and found herself face to face with the precision of gratitude she had no blueprint for. The gray-suited man who stepped forward introduced himself as Richard's assistant and explained, with crisp professionalism, that the gentleman she had helped the night before wished to show their appreciation. Presents were delivered. Envelopes that would cover debts, checks with numbers that would tilt the axis of any ordinary life, scholarships, a camera wrapped in tissue for a hobby she'd lightly mentioned between orders. Amara accepted everything with the same posture she used when handing someone their pie. Steady, unembellished. She thanked them, but when the spectacle around her grew loud and the press began to ask questions she did not trust to answer, she asked quietly for one thing from the man in the Rolls-Royce. "If you're grateful, then make one call that matters. Call the person you love." He looked at her as if the words were a mirror held close. He nodded, something like a promise forming on an old face, and for a moment, the parade of cars seemed less like a show and more like a crowd moved by conscience. For the men who could buy islands, those few hours in a roadside diner had become a ledger of a different sort, one that could not be balanced by money alone. They left trunks empty of gifts but fuller of something less tangible. A new reckoning, a beginning perhaps, of how to tend what they had neglected. When dawn finally pushed its first pale light through the clouds, the storm had lost its voice. The wind that had once screamed now sighed, weak and broken. The streets were buried under glittering white dunes, and the diner stood like a survivor in a silent world. Inside, the last candle flickered beside an empty coffee pot. The air was heavy with the smell of cinnamon, smoke, and survival. Amara had fallen asleep on one of the booths, her head resting on her folded arms. Her hair was tangled, her apron stained, her hands raw from the cold, but she looked peaceful. Michael sat across from her, watching her with quiet awe. He had never met anyone who made selflessness look so natural. When the others began to wake, something had shifted. They weren't executives or heirs anymore. They were human, fragile, grateful, changed. The group of billionaires gathered near the windows, watching the pale horizon emerge beyond the frost. Their breath misted the glass, but none spoke. For a long time, silence reigned, sacred and clean. Then Michael stood. I think we owe her more than we can ever repay. No one disagreed. Not one. By the time Amara stirred, blinking at the new light, Michael had already brewed the last of the coffee. Morning, he said softly, handing her a cup. You did it. You kept everyone safe. She smiled, exhausted. I didn't do much. Just stayed awake. He shook his head. You did more than that. You reminded 15 people who forgot how to be kind that there's still good in this world. Her laughter was shy, uncertain. I didn't remind them. The storm did. It just stripped away all the noise. Outside, rescue trucks began to crawl through the snow, their sirens distant and soft. The world was waking up again. Before leaving, the guests gathered around her booth. One by one, they thanked her. Not with business cards or handshakes, but with genuine words, shaky and human. I haven't prayed in 20 years, said one man. But last night, I did. Thank you for that. Another woman, still wrapped in Amara's old blanket, whispered, You made me remember what family feels like. Amara could only nod, overwhelmed. She wasn't used to being seen. Not like this. Then Michael stepped forward. Before we all go back to our glass towers, I think we should make something right. He reached into his coat and pulled out a notebook. This place, this diner, what's it called again? She hesitated. Mama D's. It was my mother's. Then we'll bring Mama D's back to life, he said. Together. The others murmured, uncertain. But Michael looked at them, truly looked, and something in his gaze made even the proudest bow their head. We came here running from a storm, he said, but we found something worth staying for. 2 months later, when spring returned to the valley, the new Mama D's Soul Kitchen opened its doors. The same neon sign glowed again above the entrance, but brighter now, painted with gold edges that caught the sunlight. The inside had been completely rebuilt, with warm lights, wooden booths, and a wall of photos showing the blizzard night. Amara stood in her new uniform, crisp white shirt, dark blue apron, her curls free and shining. But this time, she wasn't just a waitress. She was the owner, the heart of the place. Michael kept his promise. He had gathered the 15 billionaires again, not as investors, but as volunteers. Each one contributed something. One paid for the building's restoration, another for the new kitchen, another for the community fund Amara insisted on creating. Because for her, Mama D's wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a refuge. Every week, she hosted a free meal for families struggling through hard times. Every month, she offered hot coffee to anyone who needed warmth. No questions asked. People came from all over the state to see the woman who had sheltered 15 billionaires in a storm. News crews filmed her story, headlines praised her courage, but Amara never changed. When a child asked her once if she was famous now, she smiled and said, only in the ways that matter. Michael visited often, sometimes for business, sometimes just for pie. But mostly, he came because he felt at peace there. One evening, he arrived as the sun dipped low, washing the diner in honey-colored light. Amara was at the counter, writing something on a napkin. He sat down. You're still working after hours? She laughed. Can't help it. I'm writing down my mother's biscuit recipe before I forget. Maybe you should publish it, he said gently. Call it Lessons from the Storm. She looked up at him, the man who'd once been a stranger at her door. You think people would read it? He smiled. If they knew your story, they'd never stop. Later that night, as the last customer left and the lights dimmed, Amara stood by the window, watching the streetlights glow. It was snowing again, soft, lazy flakes drifting through the air. Not a storm this time, but a reminder. She thought of that night, of fear and hope, of strangers huddled together, of how she'd almost closed the door. And she realized something profound. The greatest storms don't come to destroy us. They come to uncover us, to show who we really are when everything else is gone. Her reflection shimmered in the glass, layered over the world outside. And for the first time in her life, she felt completely at peace with who she was. A daughter, a dreamer, a giver of warmth. A year later, on the anniversary of the storm, Mama D's soul kitchen was overflowing. There were flowers everywhere, laughter in the air, and a new golden plaque by the door that read, "Kindness is the only wealth that never melts." People came not for the food, but for the feeling, the invisible comfort that lingered in every corner. Amara moved through the crowd, hugging old friends, greeting strangers like family. When Michael walked in, the room hushed for a moment. He carried a small envelope. "This is from all of us," he said, handing it to her. Inside was a single sheet, a contract naming her as the full owner of the building, free and clear. Tears welled up in her eyes. "You didn't have to." "We did," he interrupted softly. "Because that night, you gave us something money couldn't buy. You gave us a second chance at being human." As the crowd cheered, Amara looked up at the ceiling, at the warm lights reflecting on the walls, and whispered, "Thank you, Mama." She swore she could almost feel her mother's hand on her shoulder, warm and proud. Outside, the snow kept falling, each flake glowing in the streetlights like a tiny piece of grace. Inside, the music swelled, slow, soulful jazz that filled the diner with life. Michael stood beside her, smiling. "You know," he said, "I think your mother would have liked me." Amara laughed through her tears. "She would have put you to work washing dishes." He grinned. "I'd do it gladly." They stood there, side by side, watching the people they had brought together. The once-lost billionaires serving soup, the local kids laughing, the old couple swaying to the music. The storm had ended long ago, but its lesson remained. When hearts open, miracles multiply. Final CTA, moral ending. Some storms come to break us. Others come to build us. Amara Johnson didn't plan to change the world. She just opened a door on a freezing night. But that simple act of compassion melted walls money had built for decades. So if you ever find yourself facing a storm, literal or not, remember this. Your kindness might be the shelter someone's praying for. If this story touched your heart, share it. Because somewhere out there, someone needs to remember that light still exists. And sometimes, it shines brightest in the darkest night. Which part of this story touched you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to read them. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our next emotional stories.